The whole town saw her get off the stage. Not because she was beautiful, though she wasn't unpleasant to look at, but because women didn't arrive alone in Harlan Creek on a Thursday in November without some kind of story behind them. The kind of story that made men glance twice and women pull their shawls a little tighter. Her name was Delia Marsh. She was 28 years old, and she carried a single carpet bag that looked like it had survived worse journeys than this one. She wore a brown traveling dress that had been let out at the seams, and she wore it without apology. That was the first thing people noticed about her, if they were paying attention. Not the dress, not the bag, but the fact that she didn't look down when she stepped off the stage and felt the eyes of Harlan Creek settle on her like a second coat she hadn't asked for. She looked straight ahead. The stagecoach had come down from Pueblo, 4 hours late because of a washed-out stretch of road north of the canyon. She had been sitting inside that coach since dawn with a traveling salesman who smelled of camphor oil and a farm wife who slept with her mouth open. Delia had spent those hours watching the land change outside the window, red rock giving way to scrub pine giving way to the wide flat basin where Harlan Creek sat tucked against the base of a long gray ridge. She had $41 folded inside her left boot. That was all she had. That, and the name of a man written on a piece of paper that she'd already memorized and didn't need to carry anymore. Fletcher Kane, owner of the Kane Timber Company, the largest lumber operation in the county. Her cousin Bess had worked for him 3 years back, keeping ledgers, and Bess said he was difficult but not cruel. Bess said the pay was fair and the work was real. Bess said if you could stand being invisible for the first few weeks, eventually he'd treat you like a person. Delia thought she could manage invisible. She'd had plenty of practice. She stood on the plank sidewalk in front of the express office and let the noise of the town settle around her. The ring of iron from the smithy 2 streets over, the low pull of wind through the gap in the ridge, a dog barking somewhere to her left. A boy of maybe 12 was watching her from beside a hitching post, not unkindly, just watching the way boys do when something new arrives. "The cane mill," she said to him. "How far?" He pointed north along the main road, past the feed store and the Methodist church. "1.5 miles," he said. "Maybe 2. She thanked him, picked up her bag, and started walking. The mill was louder than she'd expected. She heard it before she saw it. A high mechanical scream of blade on wood that cut through the pine-cold air and made her jaw clench the first time it hit her. The road curved around a stand of spruce, and then the whole operation opened up in front of her. The main building with its corrugated roof, the long stacks of cut timber curing in the yard, a pair of draft horses standing patient and enormous near the loading dock, their breath rising in white clouds. Men were moving everywhere, hauling, stacking, calling out to each other over the noise. None of them paid her much attention. She found the foreman near the loading dock, a broad-shouldered man named Del Pratt who had a gray mustache and the look of someone who'd already had a hard morning. She told him she was looking for Fletcher Kane. She told him she'd come about bookkeeping work. He looked at her the way men sometimes did, starting at her face, moving down, and making a quiet calculation that had nothing to do with her qualifications. "We got a bookkeeper," he said. "Your bookkeeper left 2 weeks ago," she said. "I know because my cousin Bess worked here before him, and she got a letter last month saying the position might open up again." Del Pratt's mustache shifted. "Bess Crandall?" "Bess Crandall." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wait here," and went inside. She waited. A man carrying a plank gave her a long look as he passed. She pretended to study the ridgeline. Del came back and said Fletcher Kane would see her in 10 minutes. She followed him through a side door into a long, narrow building that served as the mill office, a room that smelled of sawdust and pine tar and old coffee. There was a desk buried under stacked paper at the far end. There was a stove that needed feeding, and there was a man standing with his back to her, looking out a small window at the yard, who didn't turn around when she came in. "Sit down," he said. She didn't. She stood in front of the desk and waited. After a moment, he turned. Fletcher Kane was somewhere around 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now was just weathered. Deep lines around the mouth, pale gray eyes that took in everything and gave back very little. He was tall and lean in the way of men who've worked outdoors for 30 years and let the work take whatever fat they started with. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back at him. "You're Bess Crandall's cousin," he said. "Yes. She was a good bookkeeper." "I know. She taught me." He sat down in the chair behind the desk and picked up a pen, though he didn't write anything with it. "I need someone who can read a bill of lading, reconcile accounts against a running ledger, and catch errors before they become problems." I've had 2 bookkeepers in 3 years. The first one couldn't keep up. The second one, he stopped. The second one I had to let go. She waited to see if he'd explain. He didn't. The pay is $12 a month, he said. You'll board with a family in town, the Hennessy house on Maple Street, Mrs. Hennessy takes in respectable boarders. It's $2 a month out of your wages. You work Monday through Saturday, 7 in the morning until the work is done. Some days that's 5 o'clock. Some days it's later. What happened with the accounts? She said. He looked at her sharply. You said you had to let your last bookkeeper go, she said. Which means the accounts have been sitting unattended. For how long? 6 weeks. Are there discrepancies? He set the pen down. There may be. Then you need someone who can find them. She paused. I can find them. He was quiet for a long moment. The mill outside screamed through another cut. Then he said, You can start Monday. She said, I'll start tomorrow. He looked at her again. Not the way Del Pratt had looked at her. This was different. This was the look of a man recalibrating. The Hennessy house, he said finally. Tell Martha I sent you. She thanked him without smiling and walked back out into the cold. Martha Hennessy was a widow who kept a clean house and didn't ask questions beyond the ones you offered her. She showed Delia to a room on the second floor with a good iron bed and a window that looked out over the back lot, where a stand of cottonwoods had gone yellow gold for autumn and glowed in the late afternoon light like something lit from inside. Meals are at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, Martha said. No guests above the ground floor. The bath is on Thursdays. I heat the water myself. She paused at the door. You're working for Fletcher? Starting tomorrow. Martha made a small sound that could have meant several things. Well, she said, he's not easy. And then she left Delia alone in her room. Delia sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. She set the $41 on the coverlet and counted it again, even though she knew exactly how much was there. Then she put it back in the boot, lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and was asleep in under a minute. She arrived at the mill at 6:45 the next morning, which was 15 minutes before she was supposed to be there. She did this because she wanted to see the accounts before Fletcher Kane arrived, without anyone watching her look surprised at what she found. What she found was worse than she'd expected. The ledger for the third quarter was a disaster, not in the way of carelessness, but in the way of something more deliberate. Numbers transposed here and there, not randomly, but in the same direction every time. Credits underreported, debits overreported. It was the kind of pattern that looked like innocent error if you only glanced. But if you followed the thread, if you sat down and traced every transaction back against the original bills of lading, it resolved into something that made her sit very still for a long moment and stare at the wall. Someone had been taking from Fletcher Kane, slowly, carefully, over what looked like the better part of a year. She didn't say anything when Fletcher arrived at 7. He looked at her sitting at the desk with the ledger open, and the lamp pulled close and something shifted in his face, though she couldn't say what. Find anything? He said, and she couldn't tell if he was being sarcastic. Not yet, she said. Give me until noon. By noon she had a number. She had names attached to invoices. She had the shape of the thing laid out in a column of figures that was in its way as clear as a confession. She waited until Del Pratt left for lunch before she showed it to Fletcher. He stood at the desk and read through what she'd written. He read it twice. His face didn't change much, but she watched his hands, the way the knuckles went white at the edge of the desk and then slowly released. How long have you been at this? He said. Since 6:45. He looked up at her. I came early, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped. This is significant. Yes, she said. You're certain? I can be more certain by end of day. If you'll let me stay late. Stay as long as you need, he said. He straightened up and looked out the window at the yard, where his men were moving in their usual patterns, none of them knowing what had just shifted in the small office behind the glass. Don't say anything to anyone, he said. I wasn't planning to, she said. He nodded once and went back outside. She stayed until 7 that evening. When she finally walked back into the main room to tell Fletcher she was done, she found him standing at the stove with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he held out to her without comment. She took it. They stood in the near dark, the lamp on the desk casting a low orange light over the papers she'd spent the day with. His name's in there 4 times, she said. Same invoice numbers altered in the same way. He got sloppy near the end. Fletcher said nothing. It's not a small amount, she said. I know what the amount is. She drank her coffee. It was strong and slightly burnt and better than anything she'd had all day. You said your last bookkeeper, she started. He was the one doing it, Fletcher said. Flat, without heat. The way you say a thing when you've had several weeks to get used to the shape of it. She nodded. Bess didn't know that. When she wrote to me, Bess couldn't have known. It started after she left. She set her cup down on the edge of the stove. So what you need isn't just someone to keep the books going forward, she said. You need someone to go back and reconstruct how much was actually taken, so you have something to bring to the county sheriff that holds up. He looked at her. That's right. That'll take longer than one day. I expect it will. She reached for her coat, which was hanging on the peg near the door. Then I'll be back at 6:45 Monday morning, she said. She was almost out the door when he said, Why'd you come early today? Before I got here. She paused without turning around. Because I wanted to see what was there before anyone could tell me what to see, she said. Or what not to see. The cold hit her when she stepped outside, clean and sharp like a door swung open. She walked back toward town with her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets and the ridge going purple against the last of the sky to the west. The trouble with Harlan Creek was what trouble always is in small towns. It talked. By the end of her first week, Delia had become a subject of discussion that had very little to do with her actual work. She heard most of it secondhand. Martha had a way of relaying town opinion without quite endorsing it, but some of it she heard directly. The mill hands had their own language for women who arrived without husbands in small western towns, and it wasn't a kind one, and she'd been called most of the versions of it by the end of the second day. She didn't react, not visibly. There was a man named Bert Quill who worked in the yard and seemed to believe that his 12 years at the cane mill gave him the right to an opinion on everything that happened inside it. He'd started making comments, nothing you could pin down exactly, more the kind of thing said loudly enough to carry while never quite being said to her face. The other men thought it was funny, mostly. The way men do when no one's told them yet that it isn't. She kept doing her work. The accounts were a long excavation. Every time she found one thread and pulled it, 3 more came loose. By the middle of the second week, she had a clear picture of the original bookkeeper, a man named Aldous Crane, who had apparently possessed both a talent for figures and a serious gambling debt, and what he'd done to the Cane Company's books over the course of 14 months. The total amount came to $312. She laid it out for Fletcher on a Wednesday afternoon in a single sheet of paper, with every transaction documented and cross-referenced. He read it standing up again in the same way he'd read the first summary, methodically, thoroughly, without any visible reaction until he reached the bottom of the page. 312, he said. Yes. He set the paper down. Crane's in Denver. That's not my part of it, she said. He almost smiled. She noticed it because it was the first time she'd seen anything like it on his face, a slight change at the corners of his mouth, there and gone. No, he said. That's mine. She went back to the current ledger. The mill went on being loud outside the window. The thing she hadn't counted on was the cold. She'd grown up in Missouri, which had its winters, but nothing like what came down off the ridge at the end of November in Harlan Creek. The first hard freeze arrived on a Thursday night, and by Friday morning there was ice in the water pail on her bedroom floor, and her breath hung in the air above her when she woke up. She went to work anyway. She went to work every morning that month, 6:45, regardless of weather. She wore her heaviest dress and her wool coat and a pair of boots she'd had resoled in town, and she walked the 1.5 miles from the Hennessy house to the mill and was at her desk before anyone else arrived. She built up the fire in the office stove herself, because she'd learned that if she didn't, no one would until Fletcher got there, and Fletcher usually didn't get there until 7:15. It was on one of those cold mornings, a Thursday, the 15th of November, frost still on the inside of the window, that Bert Quill finally said something directly to her face. She had stepped outside to hand a bill of lading to one of the drivers, and Quill was standing with a group of men near the loading dock. When she turned to go back inside, he said, loud enough for the group, "Doesn't seem right, a woman running the books. No offense to present company." He said it in the way people say no offense when they mean the opposite. The men around him went quiet in that particular way, not uncomfortable, exactly, waiting. Delia looked at him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flush or look at the ground. "Bert," she said, "do you know what Aldous Crane took from this operation?" He blinked. "What? Aldous Crane, the last man who ran these books. Do you know what he took?" Quill's face shifted. "I heard some things. $312, she said. Over 14 months, while you and everyone else here were working." She let that sit for a moment. "I found it in 5 days, so." She looked at him steadily. "If you'd like to keep having this conversation, we can. But I'm going back inside now, because it's cold. and I have work to do." She went back inside. Behind her, she heard nothing for a moment. Then the sound of someone. She thought it was one of the younger hands, exhaling through his teeth in the way that meant she'd landed it. Fletcher was in the office. He was standing at the window facing the yard, which meant he'd seen it. When she came in, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't have to explain yourself to him." "I know," she said. She sat down and opened the ledger. "I wasn't explaining myself. I was explaining the situation." He turned from the window. That almost smile again. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," she said, and she didn't look up from the page. December came. The snow came with it. Real snow, heavy and steady, the kind that muffled the sound of the mill for the first few hours of every storm and made the whole ridge go white and still. Delia learned the rhythms of the place. She learned which invoices came in behind schedule and from which suppliers, and she built in a small float to account for it. She reorganized the filing system, which had been based on an entirely personal logic that Aldous Crane had apparently carried in his head and neglected to write down anywhere. Fletcher noticed. He didn't say so directly. He wasn't that kind of man, but she could tell by the way he stopped double-checking her work. In the early weeks, she'd sometimes come in to find that he'd gone back through her entries the previous evening and made small marks in pencil that indicated he'd reviewed them. After the quill incident, the pencil marks stopped. She noticed that too, and said nothing about it. The mill had a rhythm that she'd grown to find almost comforting. The high scream of the blade, the knock and thud of stacked lumber, the voices of men calling to each other across the yard. She worked through it the way you work through weather, letting it be background, and in the quiet gaps she built the kind of clear records that made everything visible and nothing surprising. That was what she was good at. Making things visible. It was Del Pratt who told her, in the way that gruff men tell things when they've decided to respect you. Sideways, while looking at something else. They were both standing at the supply window one afternoon in late December when he said, without preamble, "Crane was smart enough. Smarter than people thought. Took 3 of us almost a month to figure out even part of what he'd done." She said, "Fletcher brought in a man from Pueblo," Del said, "to go through the books after we let Crane go. Took him 2 weeks. Came back with a number that was off by $60 from what you found." She looked at Del. He was still looking out the supply window at the yard. $60 is $60, she said. "That's what I said." He pushed off the sill and went back to work. She stood at the window for a moment, alone. Outside, the yard was white with new snow, and the men were moving through it with their breath rising, hauling lumber in the gray winter light. The county sheriff came on a Tuesday in the first week of January. He was a man named Abel Trout, thin, deliberate, with the manner of someone who'd been a sheriff long enough that the job had gotten into him somewhere deep. He sat at the desk in the mill office across from Fletcher, and Delia stood to one side with the full accounting she'd prepared, which was now bound in a folder and organized by date. Trout looked through it slowly. He asked her several questions. How she'd found the first discrepancy, what method she'd used to trace the alterations, how she'd verified the original amounts against the bills of lading. She answered each one precisely. When he was done, he closed the folder and set it on his knee. "You prepared this?" he said, looking at her. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." He looked at Fletcher. "This is the clearest documentation I've seen brought to me in 8 years of this job," he said. He said it the same way he might say, "The weather was cold," as a simple fact without flourish. Delia looked at the floor and then made herself stop looking at the floor. "We'll want you available to speak to the matter if this goes to a hearing," Trout said to her. "I'll be available," she said. After Trout left, Fletcher stood at the window for a long time. The yard below was quiet. Lunch hour. The snow was clean and untouched out beyond where the men had been walking, and the ridge was high and white against the pale sky. "My brother told me not to hire you," he said. She waited. "He came by the end of your first week. Said it wasn't right having a woman in the office. Said the men would." He stopped. "Said it would cause problems." "Did it?" she said. He considered. "Some. Less than he thought." He turned from the window. "He also said you probably couldn't do the work." She said nothing. "I told him I'd make up my own mind," Fletcher said. He sat down behind his desk, which he almost never did during the day. He was usually in the yard or on the floor. It meant he was going to say something that he'd thought about. "The job is yours as long as you want it. $12 a month, same terms." She nodded. "I'm also," he stopped. Started again. "The work you did. Reconstructing the accounts. That was beyond what I hired you to do. I'd like to pay you for it separately. I'm thinking $20. She thought about the $41 that was no longer in her boot. because she'd spent most of it by the end of November on the resold boots and a second pair of wool stockings and a month's board, and one Sunday dinner that cost more than she'd planned at the hotel restaurant because she'd needed very badly to sit somewhere quiet and eat something warm and not talk to anyone. "I'll take 30, she said. Fletcher looked at her. "The man from Pueblo charged you more than that," she said, "and he got the number wrong." The almost smile came back. This time it stayed a little longer. 30, he said. The hearing was in February, when the snow on the ridge was still deep and the days were just beginning to stretch, long enough to remind you that spring was theoretically possible. Aldous Crane had been located in Denver and brought back to Harlan Creek under the arrangements that Abel Trout had set in motion, and the proceedings took place in the county courthouse 3 streets from the mill. Delia sat in the witness chair and answered every question put to her. She had her documentation with her, but mostly she didn't need it. She'd been through the numbers so many times that they'd become as familiar as anything she'd memorized. The defense attorney, a man from Colorado Springs, tried twice to suggest that her methodology was flawed. She explained, each time, why it wasn't. On the second try, he pressed her on a specific invoice, and she told him, from memory, the date, the supplier, the listed amount, and the corrected amount, and what the difference between them represented. He didn't try a third time. Crane sat at the defense table and looked at his hands throughout. He was a thin man who looked thinner than he probably had the last time he'd been here, and he didn't look at Delia once. She didn't take any satisfaction in it. She wasn't there for satisfaction. She was there because the numbers were correct, and she could account for every one of them, and because the work she'd done in those long, cold mornings in the mill office deserved to be stood behind. She stood behind it. After the hearing, she walked back to the mill instead of going to the Hennessy house. It was a cold afternoon, but the sky was very clear. That particular blue you only get in the mountains in winter, deep and hard and clean. The road was packed snow that had been worn to almost ice, and she walked carefully, her hands in her coat pockets. The mill was running. Of course it was, the mill ran most days, and she could hear it from the road before she turned the corner and saw the yard. The blade through wood, the knock and settle of stacked lumber, the smell of pine and cold air. She went into the office. Fletcher wasn't there. She built up the fire in the stove, which had burned low, and she sat down at her desk and opened the current ledger to where she'd left off 2 days ago before the hearing. There was no great moment, no applause, no ceremony. The numbers were there to be reconciled, and she reconciled them, and the fire picked up behind her and the room went slowly warm. Fletcher came in around 3. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. "Well," he said. "Guilty," she said without looking up. "Crane, I heard." He came inside and hung up his coat. "You're back at work." "I wasn't gone long." He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd reheated when she built the fire. He didn't say anything else for a while. She didn't need him to. She had a ledger and a lamp and a stove that was finally warm, and the work was clear in front of her. Outside, the mill was loud with men doing what they knew how to do. Inside, she was doing what she knew how to do. That was enough. That, she thought, was exactly enough. The blue winter light came through the small window above her desk and fell across the page, and she turned to the next column and kept working.